Welcome to The Time Capsule, stories from an abandoned and forgotten America with John Plaschel, immortalizing fascinating memories through first-hand stories from those that once occupied America's beautifully abandoned and forgotten structures.
Welcome, everybody, to The Time Capsule, Episode 3, Stories from Abandoned and Forgotten America. And this one is a doozy, I can promise you that. Really enjoyed my last two guests, and this is a guest that is so very special for a number of reasons that you'll find as we go along for the next 90 minutes or so. But before I introduce her, I want to acknowledge a couple folks that are here in our presence that you can't see right now. One of them is Eugene Butler, who is the class of 1968 from St. Emma Military Academy. Eugene was the first guest that I ever interviewed on this podcast, and really had an enjoyable time. And it was nice hearing so many comments from so many St. Emma and St. Francis alum about the content of that podcast. And we're hoping that we did a really nice job honoring the legacy of that school. Speaking of that school, Robert Walker, a few years older than Eugene, class of 1965. Although he may not admit it, we're going to call him the St. Emma historian, another man that is so very passionate about his alma mater and close friends with our guest today from St. Francis. Bob, glad to have you on board, buddy. And finally, Jennifer Saunders. Jennifer is a PhD candidate at the University of Virginia, and she is studying both anthropology and archaeology. And unless I'm mistaken, you were going in a different direction for your PhD dissertation until you came and met these individuals from these amazing schools and decided to change your dissertation. So Jennifer is here observing this podcast so she can meet some alum and learn a few things today. So welcome aboard. So I have the honor of introducing Peggy Granderson. Peggy is a St. Francis de Sales alumni from the class of 1964 and a friend of mine. And Peggy and so many of the other St. Francis and St. Emma alumni have been so generous and gracious and accommodating and friendly to me and to Fred and to all the others who are so inquisitive about both of these schools and their historical significance. As you all know, the purpose of this podcast is not necessarily to educate you on the history of the schools, although I'm going to talk a little bit about that, but to really dig deep into the stories that occurred within their walls, because the goal of this podcast is to immortalize everything that happened at both of those schools. And we thought, what a perfect way to do it in a podcast studio. So that's exactly what we're going to do. A lot of what you're going to hear today is specific to Peggy's experience at St. Francis de Sales in Powhatan, Virginia in the early 60s. And we really hope that you enjoy it. But before I introduce her, I wanted to offer a little bit of background on exactly what that school is, because the relevance of her experience and that school it's very unique. Actually, both schools are very unique. The boys' school, the St. Emma Military Academy, which was nearby, is still to this day the only African-American military academy in the history of America. And the girls' school, which was started by an heiress to the Drexel fortune, Katharine Drexel, in 1899, she was posthumously canonized as a saint 45 years after she passed away, and dedicated her massive inheritance to the advancement of Native and African American education. And the schools that I'm referring to, including Peggy's alma mater, St. Francis, was one of those schools where a number of, actually 5,000, if my history stands correct, African American ladies were educated. And the school closed in 1970 for a number of reasons, largely desegregation. The building still stands today. It's not in great shape. You're going to see some pictures today that will show what it looks like currently, which I know for some of the young ladies at St. Francis might not be easy to stomach, but nonetheless, we want to give you an accurate picture of what that school looks like. But more importantly, we really want to get a glimpse into what life was like at St. Francis. And we're going to be able to do that today through the prism of one of the sweetest people I know and one of the nicest ladies I know, Peggy Granderson. Welcome, Peggy.
Thank you, John.
I'm so happy that you're here. And I know that we've been talking about this, gosh, for months.
Yes.
For months. And we finally were able to make this happen.
Right.
So let me start. And I'm going to open up with a question that is just pretty generic, and that is just to tell us about yourself. We'd really like to know something about Peggy Granderson. And when I say that specifically, if you don't mind mentioning where you're from and a little bit about where maybe you went to middle school and how you ended up going to St. Francis. Do you mind just chatting with us about that?
Of course I will.
Okay.
And I must say it's always a pleasure being in your company.
Thank you.
And thank you for inviting me today. I grew up in Richmond, Virginia. That's my hometown. Richmond is my hometown. I only attended one school here in Richmond, starting out Randolph Elementary, that was on Randolph Street in what was then known as the near West End. And I went through to 7th grade at Randolph, and that part of the school was the junior high school. The school is now a home for many senior citizens. It's an adult home. But I have lots of fond memories. That was during an era when I could walk all over the West End. No problems, no fear. Initially, I was home with my mom and dad on the weekends because both of my parents worked. Sometimes my mom worked double shifts in the hospital where she was a registered nurse. On Sunday evening, they would pack my little suitcase and I would go to my paternal grandparents, also in the West End. And from there, I would go to school. And my grandmother became well known in that school for her delicious pound cakes. She was always sending my teachers a few slices of cake. In warmer months, I would take roses from my grandfather's rose garden. So I was a well-liked student.
I can see that. I bet you they love that cake too.
They love that cake,
wow,
yes.
Okay.
And I found out about, well, let me back up before I get into finding out about St. Francis.
Sure.
My mother had attended a boarding school in Fredericksburg because where she attended school in Louisa, Virginia, there was no school after a certain point. So her dad sent her and her sisters to a boarding school in Fredericksburg. And from there, she came to Richmond and entered nursing school. One of her co-workers in later years had a daughter at St. Francis. So that's how I learned about St. Francis. And while I was still in junior high or middle school, we came or went up on a Sunday to visit the property. And that student, Antoinette Davis, took us all over the campus, introduced us to various nuns, and I wanted to come.
So that visit, did that pique your curiosity and interest, or did it sell you on
It sold me. My mom had piqued my interest just from stories she used to tell me about her years in boarding school. So I always wanted to go away to school.
Okay.
I guess I passed muster because I was accepted.
So back up for a second. So this young lady, Antoinette, was an alum or a current student?
An alum.
Okay, so...
What I take that back. She was a current student at that time. That was, when we went to visit, I think that was her senior year.
Okay.
Yeah.
And when I say young lady, I have to tell the crowd a pretty funny story because I made the mistake once upon a time of greeting them or addressing the alumni from St. Francis as ladies. And then I spoke to Loretta Boyd, and she set me straight. And Loretta, if you're out there, thank you very much, because you all are young ladies, and that is how you are. When you hear the term young ladies, that's how I will always address you.
Right.
And that is the proper way to address an alumnus from St. Francis, correct?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah, okay. So Antoinette brought you and your family to the campus?
Yes, we drove up on a Sunday.
Okay, and do you recollect that, still recollect that day where did you fall in love with the architecture, the students, or just the whole vibe?
The whole vibe.
Okay.
And going back to that time, as well as my time at St. Francis, if visitors made the mistake of coming into the front parlors, the nuns would converge. New students' parents, their first time visiting their daughter, they would come into the parlor where they would be made comfortable. But they didn't get very much visitation with their daughter because the nuns, one after another, would come by, and not having had outside contact over so many weeks, or with some of them months, they would just be in a talkative mode, and no one could get a word in. And that was the case the first time my parents visited me as a freshman. They made a mistake of coming to the door and ringing the bell, and they were welcomed into the parlor. Well, I didn't get much visitation in that Sunday. So after that, they stayed in the car. And if I didn't see them come up, somebody would alert me that my parents were waiting for me in their vehicle.
Interesting point, and I'm learning something new here, and thank you for sharing that. So you had the luxury, unlike most young ladies from St. Francis, of being local, correct?
Correct.
And were many of your fellow students that you got to know were probably from either outside of the Richmond area or outside of Virginia?
My class consisted of two other girls from, and I will say girls rather than young ladies.
You have that luxury. Yeah, that's fine.
Two other girls from Virginia, from the Tidewater area.
And that's it?
That's it, yes.
So from how far away did some of the young ladies come?
All points south, North and South Carolina, Florida, Georgia, Philadelphia, New York, Washington, Baltimore. And I must add, Mother Catherine also established a boarding school outside of Philadelphia, in Bensalem, Pennsylvania. And it was coeducational, and it was for very young children. Most of the students were from the northern cities whose parents did not want to have latchkey kids after school. And there were no babysitters available. So they sent them to Holy Providence, or HP as it was known. Because my freshman year, when the Mother Superior, Mother Rose Philippine, came into the classroom, for some reason, she said, "And where are my HP girls?" Well, I was looking around. I did not know what an HP girl was. I did find out later. We had 5 HP girls in my class. And I am still in touch with some of them today. Going back to my time coming into St. Francis, the summer before actually arriving on campus, the other 2 students from Virginia, there's one more, I take that back, was from Virginia. So the 4 of us came on campus on a Saturday during that summer. And we were given a basic IQ test, if you will, academic test, that was timed and had a proctor. And we did not know until the following week whether we had passed, which we all did. So I guess it was the end of August, we returned to the property as freshman students. And on that day, whether you came by automobile, bus, or if you flew in to Richmond and then went to the bus station, there was a special bus that brought the students out to the school. The bus started in New York, stopped in Philadelphia, New Jersey, Washington, D.C., and students from the Maryland areas met the bus at a certain point and came down to the school on that bus. But we were ushered onto the ground floor laundry room where nuns were sitting at various tables, and our luggage was placed by these tables, which they opened. They took out every item that was in our luggage. We were only allowed to have certain items of clothing. We had a navy blue suit for Sunday Mass, for holy days, for feast days, which we wore with black high-heel shoes. To go along with our uniforms, we had black and white saddle Oxfords and bobby socks, white bobby socks. For free time on Saturdays or Sundays after Mass and after breakfast, you could change into one of two shirtwaist dresses, one pleated skirt, casual skirt, and a blouse. You were allowed 2 sweaters as well as a green sweater that we wore when our blazers were sent to the cleaners during the year. Uniforms did not come in, I think it was like three weeks or maybe a month before we got our uniforms, because we had to be measured and everything for that. So during that time, we were allowed to wear the shirtwaist dresses and the extra skirt that we brought along. We could also bring a party dress and a formal dress. Party dress was for teas that we had among the student body, the female student body at St. Francis. We had recitals. We wore our party dresses for the recitals, for plays, that kind of thing. We had maybe 2 formal activities throughout the year with the cadets from St. Emma, and then we would put on our formal gowns. Well, let me tell you about my formal gown.
Uh-oh, okay.
My mother asked her coworker, what type of formal gown? Keeping in mind now, we could not wear anything straight. Nothing could be fitted to our bodies. So my mother had someone make this gown with all of these layers of organza, I think it was. And it almost took up 3 seats when I sat down. Because when we had functions with the cadets, we would go in and seat it in whether it was the Quonset hut or the gym. For formal affairs, we would be upstairs in the flamenco room, which is the room right above Fiesta Hall. Fiesta Hall was the dining room. And we would sit in a seat, leaving 2 empty seats on either side of us. The cadets would march in, and the officer of the day would give the order for them to be seated. And so there would be a cadet on either side of us. I had to hold my dress in so that they could sit down. Needless to say, no one asked me to dance with all of that
come
dress.
on.
So finally, I got tired of sitting there, and we had an orchestra from Richmond, and you wouldn't believe it, but the leader of this group was the son of my minister from home. So I went up and walked over to the stage, and he turned around and saw me, and it was like, "Oh, here you are." And I said, "I'm Peggy Granderson. I know who you are. You're Lynn and Bessie's daughter." And we passed a few words, and I told him to be sure and give my regards to his dad. His father was totally against me going to St. Francis.
For what reason?
He was afraid that I would become Catholic, that I would convert.
Which you ultimately did do,
Which
correct?
I ultimately did do.
And were you baptized at that altar?
I was baptized at that altar.
Okay, let me stop for 1 second. This is such valuable information. I'm trying to internalize everything here, and my head is spinning. I got a lot of questions.
Okay.
First of all, the first thing we're going to do is we're going to pull up a picture for the audience to show a picture of Peggy and her daughter and her granddaughter at the altar where she was
correct,
basically baptized.
Right.
While you were a student
Yes.
at St. Francis.
Yes.
And this is the three of them, three lovely ladies sitting in what was this gorgeous, gorgeous Catholic chapel where they would attend Mass how many days a week?
You could attend Mass every day. Mandatory days were, I believe, Friday and Sunday.
Okay.
If you did not attend Mass on the other days of the week, you got an extra half an hour to stay in bed. But keep in mind, there was to be no talking in the dormitory, ever.
And if there was?
And if there was, and if you were caught, there were either demerits or you were restricted from attending a social function on the upcoming weekend. It was only one time that I can remember some of my classmates as well as myself getting caught creating a ruckus during Mass time. We did not realize we were that loud. And I remember it had to have been the senior year because we were sleeping in Maria Goretti Dormitory, which was a small dormitory for seniors. And when it was too late, we heard the rosary beads coming. And there was nowhere to hide. Girls started running. Well, I couldn't get back to my roomette. So I tried to get at this locker at the end of the room. And this girl had all of her shoes and everything else on the floor of the locker. I could not get my foot in. Well, let me tell you, everybody knew my feet in those saddle Oxfords. I had these long, narrow feet that you couldn't miss. And as I said, I just couldn't get one foot in. And the nun came in and she said, "You may as well come out of that locker, Peggy Granderson. I know your feet."
So did you get a demerit?
I didn't get a demerit, but I was restricted that upcoming weekend from the social function.
So I have several questions to talk about that. First of all, what I want to do is put up a picture for the audience to see of what the dormitory looks like that Peggy is speaking of. Now, admittedly, there are two separate areas, actually probably more than two for dormitories.
Yes.
But in the building as it stands today, the picture that I'm showing you right now, where you can see that the bed frames are still there, the lockers are still there. Many of those lockers still have stickers on them and hangers and a lot of the original stuff from the young ladies that spent the time call it a dormitory, call it a roomette. They look
Roomette.
like they were just basically partitioned off with the very basics for you, correct? Just a bed and a locker. And was there a place where you could have your privacy just by pulling a drape or a curtain?
There were curtains that you could pull together at the end of each roomette.
Okay.
And when you wanted to open, you would just pull the curtains apart and come out. We also had in the roomette something similar to a small dressing table. It had 3 drawers. I remember one drawer was for undergarments, the other was for socks and hosiery, and then a smaller drawer for hair paraphernalia, hair rollers, combs, brushes, mirrors, that kind of thing.
And is it true that the one side of the school had a dormitory maybe just for upperclassmen, and the other side of the school had a dormitory for the freshmen and the sophomore? Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I just wanted to make sure. Going way back to what you said, I was fascinated by your comment about visitation. And I always forget that the front of the school is actually the what we're looking at right now on the screen. This is actually a visual of the chapel. So if you're staring at the chapel in that bell tower, which by the way has since collapsed probably 10 or so years ago, that was the front of the school facing the James, correct?
That's
Which is
correct.
now heavily wooded. Were you all able to see the river in the wintertime from there, or was it far enough away?
You could see it in the winter from the dormitories.
From the dormitories,
Yes.
okay. But look at this beautiful facade of this Catholic chapel. And I'm also going to show you what it looks like on the inside with 2 different pictures. One from the elevated staircase right when you walk in, you're able to step up. I'm assuming there was some choir or was it the choir?
Choir loft.
Choir loft. This is the picture from the choir loft. And then also there's an amazing lighting situation in there where one of the windows that comes into the altar, when the lighting is right, shines the ray of light on the altar. And you may not have even seen this, but it's just kind of ironic that it looks like this supernatural scene of beauty and divine intervention, because you've got this gorgeous ray of light coming. You'd like to think it maybe is from Saint Katharine herself. I know you call her Mother Catherine because that's how she was greeted at that time. She wasn't posthumously canonized as a saint until about 2000. But this is what the school looks like in the wintertime. And I heard a story, and I'm not sure if it was from you, when it snowed there. Now you would go home for Christmas time, right? They would shut it down for a couple of weeks, and
Right.
the young ladies would go home. Merle, if you're listening, I loved how you would always tell me that you would sled down that hill and everything during the wintertime. It's not sleddable anymore. There's too much overgrowth. But the cutest story I heard was there was a young lady, perhaps from, I want to say, the Caribbean, and it started snowing while you all were in the dining room.
Right.
And she had never seen snow.
Yes.
Was that something you shared with me?
Yes, that was one of my classmates.
So do you recall, did she just look outside and didn't know what was happening?
Well, there were windows all around the dining room, and, tables were placed near the windows, and we could see the snowflakes coming down. They were pretty large snowflakes. And she and another classmate who was from this particular classmate was seated at my table. She was from St. Augustine, Florida, and another classmate was from Key West, Florida. And they both jumped up and ran out on the porch. And from the porch, they ran down the stairs and out into the open with their arms extended because they had never seen snow in person
Isn't
before.
that something to witness?
Yeah.
Wow. You talk about these young ladies from different parts of America.
Mm-hmm.
And if you remember from the St. Emma podcast, one thing that Eugene talked about was, I want to call them a crew, but maybe they were cliques. So at St. Emma, the New York cadets hung with the New York cadets, and the Philly cadets hung with the Philly cadets, and the Detroit cadets hung with the Detroit cadets, et cetera, DC, you name it. By and large, according to what he's saying, was there any of that at St. Francis. Now, remember, St. Francis is about a third of the size of St. Emma from an enrollment perspective. So, from what I can gather, you probably only had about 125, 130 young ladies at any given time versus 300,
Right.
400 cadets. But did you pick up on any of that where young ladies would gravitate towards other young ladies from their area?
Oh, it was very obvious. I'd like to also mention before I touch base on that, in my class, we had a student from Japan who could hardly speak any English. She did not return after the freshman year. We had a student from Aruba who, upon graduating from college, worked for, she became an interpreter for the government. And then we also had a student from Cuba whose family member was able to get her out of Cuba just before it shut down and bring her to Washington, D.C. And because this aunt was elderly and single, had to work, she sent her niece to St. Francis. And I have very fond memories of them. Now, as far as the cliques, yes, there were New York cliques. We only had one student from Detroit in my class, so she gravitated to upperclassmen who were from Detroit. Detroit students had a very strong presence during that time when we were in school. Washingtonians and Maryland girls stuck pretty much together. But as the months rolled on, the cliques broke up. I remember the HP girls really stuck to themselves, but they became friendly with everyone in the ensuing years.
And now I got to think, so she was class of 63.
Yes.
Robert, who you're friends with to this day, is class of 65. I never bothered to ask, did you guys know each other during your time in school?
I believe we met, but classes tended to stick together as far as between the two schools.
Okay.
But I remember dancing with Bob once or twice.
Is that right?
At a function, yeah, at one of the socials, yes.
What a perfect transition.
Yes.
So for those of you that have seen the St. Emma podcast, you know that there was a Quonset hut, still is there, where these spiffy St. Emma Military Academy cadets would get ready on Friday or Saturday nights, depending on if you were an underclassman or an upperclassman. And they would march to St. Francis to have a social or a dance in the Quonset hut. And this was closely monitored by the nuns, who were very strict about making sure that there was plenty of distance between the cadet and the young lady when they danced. But this is something that the St. Emma alum constantly talk about. You know, it was a reprieve from the daily grind of what they were having to go through Monday through Friday, and this was a chance for them to socialize with the opposite sex and dance and converse and have a really nice time with these young ladies from St. Francis. And I think it was pretty regular that
yes.
happened, correct? And was that optional or mandatory for you? And the second question is, and be honest, did you look forward to it?
Freshman year, it was mandatory.
Okay.
For the girls. I don't know about the cadets. Afterwards, it was optional, and we had social functions at least once during the weekend or twice. We attended basketball games, football games at St. Emma. We walked, of course, from one school to the other. Everyone always had a boyfriend or a girlfriend. And we remained close over the years. After I graduated, I became close with even people that were not at school when I was there. They had graduated long ahead of me. I will say there remains a camaraderie like no other, I think, in the world. In fact, my daughter has 2 godfathers from St. Emma. They're not in my class. They're in Bob's class. But I didn't really know one of them at all in school. I met him at a social function in later years when we were all grown and having our children. And so families became close. Our children started growing up together. It was just awesome, the camaraderie that we have.
And this is so very important, and this is integral to the whole story, because here we are 50-some years post-graduation, and the young ladies from St. Francis that I've spoken to, primarily you, Chase, Merle, Mary. Hey, Mary, how you doing? Haven't talked to you in a while. But I noticed this cohesiveness and this bond that you probably just don't see from public schools. Now, granted, people stay friends throughout, but this is something special. This is something different. And the same can be said about St. Emma, how the cadets are just tight. And it just seems that you guys experience something so unique and so special. And you were isolated, so you had to become very good friends.
True.
That remains strong, if not stronger, to this day. And when you say camaraderie, I'm assuming you just don't mean amongst the young ladies yourselves. No. You're talking about camaraderie.
Right.
Like St. Francis and St. Emma, you guys still have your own alumni Facebook groups. When you have your reunions, they're together, correct?
They're together.
That's awesome.
They were started by the New York chapter, I believe. And then in ensuing years, chapters in different cities would host the reunions. So we traveled all over for reunions. And I got to meet so many people that I hadn't known before. It was like a family outside of your family. We shared personal history, personal problems. If there was someone who was really having personal issues, we did what we could to assist them from afar. In later years, we have attended funerals of alum. I think I have been to 2 funerals of my classmates. It's just a cohesiveness that I have never heard anyone from college talk about. My daughter has her friends from college, but they're not as close as we are.
Isn't that something?
All of my schoolmates know my daughter. Everyone knows Robin. How's Robin doing? Now they ask about Cameron. Last year, when we took Cameron to JMU for her freshman year.
Go Dukes.
Yeah. I remembered one of my classmates from Harrisonburg, her address. It was always at the back of one of the yearbooks. And I said to Robin during a downtime, drive me over to Broad Street. And I said, that's the house. I know that's the house. That's the house number. Oh. And I got out and rang the bell, and my classmate came to the door. She had since relocated back to the family home place. And I said, hi, Tish. And she said, hello, very guarded. I said, you don't know me, do you? And she said, and I opened the storm door. And I said, Tish, it's Peggy. Well, she just went wild.
In a good way.
In a good way.
Yeah.
She came flying through the doorway, grabbing me and hugging me, So I plan to see her this coming weekend when we take Cameron back to school. But just very special. Very special.
And I'm assuming a lot of that time that you guys spend together is spent reminiscing from your days back in school. And that's what I would call the cherry on top, is that strong bond that the young ladies have. From an outsider's perspective, that's something obviously we can't appreciate because we didn't experience it. But it accentuates the importance of the legacy of that school, because this all occurred in one of only a couple dozen schools that Saint Catharine created.
Right.
And which leads me to my next question. Like the cadets at St. Emma, if you interview most of them, they didn't appreciate the historical significance of the fact that they were on the property of the only African-American military academy in America. All they wanted to do was survive and get by. Did you all also, as a 15, 16, 17-year-old young lady, appreciate or understand the historical relevance of what the school where you were attending?
Well, I'll say this. The history of St. Francis was somewhat drilled into us our freshman year.
Okay.
And my best friend, starting freshman year, and I were in a personal competition to see how many books we could read from the library on, at the time, Saint Katharine and her different schools. There used to be a publication that came out, I think, 3 times a year. I can't remember the name, but it spoke of her different schools around the country, even those in Arizona with the Native Americans there. It was quite a history, and then to learn her connection with the Beauva family and Jacqueline Bouvier Kennedy Onassis, we always feel a connection with the Kennedy family. And I have always read as much as I could on that family. Toward the end of my freshman year into my sophomore year, my girlfriend and I decided we were going to become nuns.
Is that right?
That's right.
Okay.
And needless to say, I didn't go in that direction. She did, and she became a Sister of the Blessed Sacrament. So her home base now is where the homebody of nuns resides, because they are no longer on the property at Ben Salem. They've relocated somewhere in Pennsylvania. But for many years, when she had the opportunity to have her home visit once a year, since she didn't have immediate family, she came here to Richmond and stayed with me for a week for her home visit.
Okay.
Yeah.
So Peggy brings up 2 interesting points that I'm going to need to elaborate on from a historical perspective when she's talking about the Beauva family. So Francis Drexel, whose brother primarily was in business with J.P. Morgan, I think it's old Chase Manhattan money. Very wealthy individuals. Well, Francis Drexel had 3 daughters. One of them was, at the time, Mother Catherine, who ultimately became a saint. She was the one that founded St. Francis de Sales in 1899. But 4 years prior to that, it's actually her half-sister. Mm-hmm. They shared different mothers. Right. So Mother Catherine's mother was not Emma Beauva. It was Louise's mother. And Louise and her husband, Colonel Edward Morrell, were actually the founders of the accompanying male military academy next door called St. Emma. When Peggy mentions the Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament, SBS, they were the founders. And I believe it was Philadelphia-based Catholic religious order that exists to this day.
Yes, St. Catharine founded Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament.
Correct.
Yes.
So that is, until recently when the property exchanged hands to a private individual, it was always SBS, or Sisters of the Blessed Sacrament. Moving on, the nuns.
Okay.
Everybody always talks about Sister Euphrasia.
Youth.
So describe to us the nuns in youth, or I'll call her Sister Euphrasia.
Right.
And there's strictness. Either, you've already mentioned to us that they would come in and monitor to make sure that you guys were asleep and not misbehaving in the dormitories.
Right.
But wasn't there a nun that would kind of sit cross-armed and watch you guys dine?
No, she wouldn't sit. That's Sister James Mary, who was the principal.
Oh, okay.
very strict. But she would do nice things for us. On any given day, she may tell the dietitian, Sister Mary Ellen, to prepare bag brown lunches or dinners for us, and we would go to the dam for a picnic. Well, the dam was located halfway between each schools, and there was a waterfall. And sometimes we would get a glimpse of a cadet or two when we were down there. But we had a good time doing that. Sometimes she would walk us all the way out to 60. On a given Saturday, when we had finished our charges, that's what our jobs were called. Everyone had a charge.
Interesting. Okay.
Today, there's I think, 2-pump gas station there. Back during our time, it was just a little convenience store. And if you had some change in your blazer pocket, she would walk us across the road or the highway, and we'd get a pop or a bag of chips and then walk back, stopping along the way, talking to various people who lived along the road, whom the nuns got to know on a very good basis. As a side on that, I will say, every year, just before we left to come home for Christmas, they would take us Christmas caroling along that road. And we would stop along the way and sing carols to certain families. In our adulthood, the Richmond chapter did a Christmas caroling up there one year. I called Sister Anna Mary, who was living at St. Emma at the time, and asked her for the names of some families in need, and she gave me names and ages. And so we went with a turkey, a ham, canned goods, personal items, clothing for children, that kind of thing. And we went to these various homes. And I'll never forget, one of the homes was back in the woods, pretty deep. And it was an elderly man who lived there by himself in this one-room home that had this pot-belly stove. I'll never forget it. And it was cold, and so we were all bundled up. And by the time we came out, we were sweating profusely. But he was so grateful. And we took our children with us. And to this day, occasionally, Robin, my daughter, will bring up, remember when we went Christmas caroling and went to that gentleman's home and how grateful he was for the little things. Those were the types of things that the Richmond Alumni Chapter used to do. But yeah, going back to the different nuns, there was Sister Matilda. Sister Matilda was the Latin and French teacher. All freshmen had to take Latin with her. And then after freshman year, she taught French. She was very, very tall. She held herself very close. She would always walk with her hands clasped. She would smile occasionally. Well, I became the mischief person in my class.
How so?
Well, it's interesting because I went there very shy and quiet to the point where they nicknamed me Goody Goody because I wouldn't break any rules. I think that stopped at the end of my sophomore year. So we would be in the classroom and I would get the bright idea, okay, at 10 o'clock, everybody look to the left out of the window. And Sister Matilda would come in, and 10 o'clock would come, and everybody would turn and look out the window. And she would be, girls, looking just like this all around. Attention, bring your attention back in. We'd be rolling.
So you would instruct these young ladies, your fellow classmates, to basically turn away.
Right.
But Sister Matilda didn't know it was you doing it?
No, she didn't know it was pre-planned. And initially, she would look out the window to see if something was going on, and then she would realize what was happening. And then there was Sister Euphrasia, as I said, we nicknamed Youth. She was this rotund, jolly nun. always cheerful and smiling. Well, we tried it on her. And her thing always was, girls, get on your knees. Let us pray. Keep your virginity. Well, we couldn't hold the laughter in because that was her mantra. Keep your virginity.
Isn't that something?
Yeah, it was hilarious.
So on a scale of 1 to 10, in retrospect, on a strictness continuum, how would you rate them? It sounds like it varied, right?
It varied.
It depended on the nun.
It did.
Okay.
You knew not to cross or try any shenanigans with Mother Rose Philippine, the Mother Superior.
So would you consider her a 10 out of 10 when it came to strictness?
Yes. To the point when I became an adult, it became my habit. This was back in the day when there were old-fashioned answering machines. And I had mine in my bedroom, and I would go in my bedroom to change my clothes, get out of my work clothes, and hit the answering machine that was on the desk. And this voice came through. I am looking for Peggy Granderson. And I just stopped in the middle of the floor and turned around and looked at the answering machine. It can't be. And I went over and I played it several times. Instead of calling this woman to see what she wanted, I started calling my classmates around the country. What is Mother Rose looking for me? Why is she looking for me? Finally, Loretta Leverett from New York, living in Massachusetts, said, Peggy, for God's sakes, you're grown. She can't do anything to you now.
And you're still wondering if you were in trouble.
I'm still wondering, what have I done to provoke her wrath?
And this is how many years later?
Oh, my God. My daughter was in college.
Oh, my goodness. But given that, and again, we'll ultimately close with this later on, but given that strictness of the environment, you still had a wonderful experience there, didn't you? I mean, It just came with the territory with the Catholic education.
Yes, and I have to say this, Mother Rose and I from that phone call became the best of friends because she learned that I was here in Richmond trying to save the property. Mm-hmm. And that was what she wanted to see happen before she closed her eyes.
Oh, did she pass? She passed?
Oh, yes, she did, but she got to come here dressed in civilian clothing because they came out of the habits, most of them, in later years, and they went back to their given names. She was no longer Sister Rose Philippine. She became Sister Jane Quilty. That was her given name. And that happened due to Internal Revenue. They were having problems with their taxes. And Internal Revenue said, we can't go on Sister James Mary. Who is Sister James Mary? What's her Social Security number? That's somebody else's Social Security number. So they went to their given names and began dressing in civilian clothing.
Stepping back a minute, when you talked about free time,
Mm-hmm.
that's important for the audience to know because, you obviously were in a strict academic environment where you were prior and going to mass and this sort of thing. So I can imagine when you had free time.
Right.
It's kind of time to let your guard down. And we're going to show the audience a picture now of some young ladies, I think way back when, 50s, 40s, maybe, I don't know. For all I know, some of the young ladies might be looking, but here's a picture of some of these young ladies that would go down to the dam. The dam that Peggy is referring to is on Deep Creek, and there's actually 2 dams. Most people don't know that, but this is where they would go to spend some time, and the cadets also would go down there. Like you said, you maybe see each other, have a picnic or what have you. Was that your primary place to go? Because you weren't really allowed to deviate very far from the school, correct?
No, and we did not go when they were down there. And the nuns would always let them know when a class of girls would be there so that no cadets would be in that area, supposedly.
One of your fellow young ladies on Facebook, her name She goes by Charmaine, one of these ones. I've not met her before, nor have I spoken to her. But she contacted me and told me that when she would be swimming in that creek, she made sure to always flail her arms around everywhere because it would scare off the black snakes and the water moccasins and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Two of Eugene's favorites, black snakes and water moccasins. But you were never really, I can imagine where this school and these nuns and these administrators have full responsibility for 125 young ladies. Got to be careful. There's a river nearby. There's a dam, probably hydroelectric or whatever. So when you had free time, you were basically mostly just staying in and around the property unsupervised. Is that where you would go? Just outside, or where would you be able to go?
If we went to the dam, a nun was always with us.
Okay.
And she would tie her skirt up to her waist.
Okay.
A certain way so that it wasn't dragging in the dirt. And she would sit with us. She didn't eat with us because during that time, nuns could only eat cloistered. They could not eat with regular people. They only ate among themselves.
So when is that like a rule?
Yes, that was a rule for them during that time.
Oh.
Yes.
So when you were dining, breakfast, lunch, or dinner, in that gorgeous dining room, I'm not sure I have a picture of it or not, but you were amongst just your fellow classmates at that point.
Exactly. They had their own dining room, which was called the rectory. And the lay teachers had their own dining room. And one semester, as my charge, I served the lay teachers. So it taught me which side to place a plate of food, which side to pick it up from, how to clear a table, how to set a proper table. Our tables in the student dining room was always preset. At, say, after breakfast, at the end of breakfast, you would set the table after it was cleaned off with a plate turned face down, cutlery, a cup, or a glass, and each student had her own personal linen table napkin and napkin ring with her name on it. Our name was sewn into every piece of garment or item that we had.
So that was something that your parents obviously would need to pay for above and beyond your standard tuition, right? They would pay for everything to be basically stitched. Is that correct?
We stitched that before going there.
Oh, you did?
Yes.
Okay.
The summer before going to St. Francis, I spent that summer sewing my name and everything. That was undergarments, socks, a tape to a toothbrush, toothpaste, everything.
Interesting.
Yes.
And to this day, do you still stay in touch with many of your fellow alum? Like how we've met Faye and we've met a couple of the others, but talk about the relationships that you've built from your days there in the 60s that remain today. Are there any young ladies you want to say hello to or that you still remain close with? And what have those relationships have been like? How gratifying have those relationships been?
Well, Faye was my little sister.
She was.
Faye came in my senior year, and I was assigned to Faye to teach her how to set up her roomette, how to make her bed. And I'll never forget, Faye came in talking. And her grandparents brought her because her grandparents met at Rock Castle and married there. Her grandfather worked at St. Emma after they married, and they lived over there for a while before moving to Richmond. But anyway, this day, after her luggage had been gone through, and I took them upstairs to the dormitory, and I was trying to show her how to make the bed because we could not have any contour sheets.
Not allowed.
Not allowed. So I was trying to show her how to make the four corners, and she was just talking. Do you know B.B. Clayton? Do you know this person? And finally, I said, listen, you have to stop talking. First of all, you need to learn how to make this bed. And if you keep talking like that, you're going to end up in a lot of trouble here. And I never forget her grandmother said, Faye, you really have to stop talking. I tell you that all the time. You talk too much. But there's Laverne Jeffries Jones in North Carolina, who's my little sister as well as my goddaughter.
Okay.
She decided to convert. There's Loretta Leverett in Massachusetts. There is Elizabeth Awkward in Virginia. Hey, little bit. That's what her family calls her,
Is
little
that
bit.
right? Okay.
Yeah. There are just so many I can't think of now. Hey, Mike Kelly, down at Myrtle Beach, South Carolina. How you doing, my brother? Bill Jones. We haven't talked in a while. There are just so many. Mike Kelly lives in Conway, South Carolina, which is like Ashland to Richmond.
Okay.
And so Mike wanted to have a reunion there one year. And nothing was happening. And I kept calling, Mike, what are you doing in preparation? Oh, I'm going to get to it. And then I realized Mike doesn't know what he's doing or how to go about this. So I called a girl who in D.C. who had done the previous year's reunion and asked her to help me with the oncoming year's reunion in Myrtle Beach. And we pulled it together. Well, of course, when I go to Myrtle Beach, I never want to go back home. So Mike's family has a family home on Atlantic Beach, which at the time was the only African-American beach in that area. And it's a lovely A-frame building. So he just turned the home over to me. And ensuing years, when we would go in October, when we would have end of the season function, which is something we started in later years, let's do Myrtle Beach every October as the last thing we'll do during the year, because we always did Columbus Day festivities and functions. So we started going to Myrtle Beach every October, as well as having an annual reunion. Excuse me, I mentioned charges.
Yes.
I don't think we touched on that. Every student had a job, and those jobs were called charges.
Okay.
Freshman year, my job was cleaning the bathroom on one of the school floors. And I'll never forget, it was either Mother Rose or Sister James Mary said, I want that porcelain sparkling. I don't want any dust in the corners of the floor. I want the soap dish of the sink so clean that I could eat a scoop of chocolate ice cream. And that stuck with me through adulthood when I taught my daughter to clean a bathroom. I said, I want to be able to eat some chocolate ice cream from there.
You know, you bring up a good point, and I'm really curious about this. I've noticed that so many of the young ladies from St. Francis, almost all of them that I've met, are similar in many characteristics as it pertains to class, poise, confidence, just the overall way you carry yourselves. And that's not a coincidence.
No, it isn't.
I almost think that and wonder if the school was influential enough to kind of assist in not creating a certain type of person, but do you still probably make your bed to this day? Or
every day.
There you go. And I'm sure you never mess up a table setting.
Nope.
And some of the I know Robin's not here, but if I were to ask her privately if her mother was strict growing up, I would say probably as strict as maybe your parents were or that your experience was. You probably didn't, you kept your eyes on her, right?
Oh, yes, I did.
And that goes to say for all of the young ladies that I've noticed, all of them. And you know what else I've noticed about the young ladies? Two things. One, I don't notice it as much with you, but it almost like they have their own dialect.
Yeah.
The way they pronounce St. Francis or something like Carol, it's not Carolyn Lambert, who, by the way, I adore.
Yeah.
Carolyn, if you're listening, thank you so much. Class of 58, she came to school in 1955, and you know what she told me?
Mhm.
That was the year that Mother Catherine died. She
Wow.
recalls, as a freshman, being told that Mother Catherine had just passed away
Wow.
in 90-some years old. But pronunciation is unique. The other thing I'll mention is you all are highly empathetic. Every alumni there. I'm not a complete stranger to many of you, but we haven't known each other for so long. And this goes to St. Emma as well. For Father's Day, I got 7 texts, and you know who 6 of them were from?
Mm.
Alumni from both of your schools.
Great.
And that's just thinking, hey, let me take a moment to text this guy. And I see that in you and Eugene and Bob and others, an appreciation and an empathy for others. And I don't know if that's something that was instilled in you in high school or not, but that's just one of my observations. Rock Castle, I do want to go back because I made the mistake of not mentioning the Rock when we went over St. Emma. And Eugene and I are like, how do we forget to talk about the Rock? I'm not going to forget about it this time. So St. Francis and Rock Castle are synonymous with each other, correct? So I'm going to throw this out there, and you correct me if I'm wrong. Rock Castle, as I know it, is a train station that is right across the river on the Goochland side.
Right.
And this was the station that, pre-bus, pre-automobile, this is where St. Francis and St. Emma alumni or students would come by train and then come across a river on this barge, which, by the way, we have a picture of. I'm going to show this to the audience here. Look at this picture of this barge, which still in the summertime, when the water is low, you can see. Isn't that amazing?
It is.
It's amazing. But that's how these students would get to school. And you hear the castle, and it looks like a castle, right?
Well, the nuns referred to it as the castle on the James.
Just the school was the castle on the James because it looked like a castle and it was on the James River. But when you called it, would you call it Rock Castle, or when do you say Rock Castle and when do you say St. Francis?
Excuse me, I learned the term Rock Castle before attending St. Francis. One of my neighbors and very close friend to my parents attended St. Emma when Mother Catherine was still alive. And when she was on campus, he was her chauffeur. And he referred to the school then as Rock Castle because of that ferry sign or the train sign, Rock Castle, Virginia. My godmother, who had attended St. Francis, also referred to it as Rock Castle.
Okay.
Because of the time that she was a student there. People in the Richmond area basically referred to the two schools collectively as Rock Castle.
The Rock and the Castle on
Yes.
the James. Okay, that helps us understand. And I've got a few other questions I want to ask you. And you kind of just answered it, but maybe you can go into a little more detail.
Okay.
Is how did your experience at St. Francis shape you as a person?
I think my experience made me become more in tune to being a lady, in tune to the way I carried myself, because it was drilled into me. Watch how you sit. Are your ankles crossed? Are your hands clasped in your lap when you had on your white gloves and you were at one of the teas or the recitals? Attention to detail, organization.
Yes.
You could not survive there. And going back to that locker with all those shoes and that junk, that girl got in more trouble for having a messy locker that day than she had up there making ruckus with us creating all that noise.
And attention to detail and these things you're speaking of, here we are X amount of years later. These are important things for personal growth.
Yes.
Right?
The only time I can remember being restricted from a social function other than that dormitory incident was during my freshman year. I had left my green sweater on the coat rack in the dining room. And I don't know at what point it was collected. I hadn't even missed it. And on Fridays, a list went up as to who was placed on restriction for whatever reason, who would not be attending the social functions. And I had never even paid any attention to this list. And so I didn't know that my dad was coming that Sunday and bringing his parents because my mother had to work a double shift in the hospital that Sunday. And I was so happy to see them, and just coincidentally, the first parade at St. Emma was that Sunday. Mm-hmm. So I ran to, after I spoke to them and greeted them, I ran back and found Mother Rose and said, "Mother, my dad and my grandparents are here. Can I ride over to St. Emma in the car?" And I'll never forget, she had her hands clasped like this with this smile. "No, dearie, you're on restriction." And I could feel the tears coming. Oh, what have I done?
Isn't that something?
I said, "Mother, what did I do?" "You left your green sweater on the coat rack in the dining room. Your dad and your grandfather can go to St. Emma, but why don't you and your grandmother sit under the trees and visit?"
And that's what happened, right?
And that's what happened. And to this day, when I come in the house, my coat goes into the coat closet or a jacket.
Wow.
When I take my clothes off, they're hung up. My shoes are placed in the closet. My jewelry is put away.
And I bet if we were to interview many other young ladies as well, they'd probably tell you the
Yes.
exact same thing. Isn't that
Yes.
something? So that's the power of the influence of what
Yes.
you guys received at that school. Before I ask you the last couple questions, you said you went over to St. Emma too. I know they came to you. Would you often go over there for football games? And you walk?
We walked.
Oh, and by the way, for all of you, I've got an old picture here that I want to show of the bridge. There was just there was one bridge that everybody knew about and another bridge that other people didn't know about. But the bridge that everybody knew about covered Deep Creek. And this is the creek that separated the two campuses. So for like sporting events and such, you would go over on the weekends to spend time over there. Here is a picture of Father Figaro cleaning up after the infamous flood. I think this is him out there with a squeegee trying to get rid of all the water. Isn't that something? But I always envisioned the boys coming to you. I never really thought about you going over there. So for like sponsors and everything, you would spend time on that campus, correct?
Yeah, and a lot of times on a Sunday or Saturday, we would go over for roller skating, those who brought roller skates from home.
Where would you roller skate?
On the blacktop. So I had never been exposed to roller skates. I only knew street skates.
Look at Eugene. He had no idea. Robert's going, yeah. So you would roller skate on the blacktop at St. Emma? What would happen if they were out there marching?
Oh, that would not be marching then. This was time dedicated to roller skating.
That is awesome.
Yes.
So was that considered exercise? Was that
free time?
Just free time.
Those that didn't skate would sit around talking, with the cadets.
Isn't that something?
Or walking around with them.
That's a long walk. Well, not for a 16-year-old. It'd be long for us now.
Well, then there were the times when there was a more formal situation and we took our heels. We carried our heels and we left them at that statue just before you go up that last incline to the big house. All of our shoes, flat shoes, would be laying around that statue, and we would have put our heels on there.
So when you were heading over to St. Emma or when you were mingling with the cadets, I'm assuming they were all in uniform.
Yes.
And you all are in uniform. And
sometimes. Yes.
Sometimes. Would you consider them just regular guy classmates, or did you look at them with the same reverence as the community would with, oh my gosh, look at this young man dressed up in this awesome, were you like, if I was to see something like that, I would just, be like, oh my God, this is awesome. But as a St. Francis young lady, did you look at him a little bit differently?
I think so.
Okay.
Yeah.
Speaking of alumni, I want to put a couple pictures up. This is a picture of the school when it originally opened. And for all you young ladies out there, take a look at all of the ivy encroaching on this. Very elegant. Now, there's ivy coming up on the building now that isn't as sightly. But I've been told that this is the original class of St. Francis. And I'm going to put a picture up as well of a commencement in 1901 of some of the first ladies that graduated from St. Francis. So obviously, if it was open in 1899, they came in not as freshmen. And these are the young ladies from over 120 years ago. And a little more recent, here is a picture that I found of the class of 1968 at the 100th anniversary of the St. Emma Military Academy. You recognize some of those names there. And I also wanted to thank Mary Hutchins and Merle Gorham and Melvina.
Yes.
And Chase Jackson. She probably doesn't remember talking to me, but man, I had a really nice conversation with her. Larita, Carolyn Lambert, wonderful lady.
Yes.
It's been very, very helpful. And speaking of older alumni, it's my understanding, I might have the name wrong, but there are some alumni that are living that are into their 90s now. Is Cynthia Reynolds, does that name ring a bell?
It does ring a bell.
Maybe from the class of the 40s. Bob, does that ring a bell? Cynthia Reynolds doesn't ring a bell. But anyhow, I ended up speaking to her, and here's some pictures that I wanted to show of the Glee Club from way back when, and some girls, some young ladies doing, it looks like some sort of event where it's like a sock hop of some sort. And you had mentioned where the nuns ate was called the rectory.
Yes.
This is what the rectory looks like now. And I know this is difficult to see, but this is where they ate. There's a couple before and after pictures here that I thought would be of interest to the audience. Here is a picture of this beautiful Catholic chapel that they attended back in the day. And there's two pictures here. Here's a couple pictures of the young ladies worshiping at Mass just on a random Sunday. And here's another picture back from the 40s of the young ladies in cap and gown. So it looks like before graduation, when you all would do it together, they might have had a commencement individually at St. Francis.
You mentioned the cadets looking a little different in their uniforms. I wish you could have seen them in their dress uniforms.
Super spiffy, huh?
Oh, they were handsome.
Oh, I
yes,
bet.
Yes,
I bet.
yes.
They're over here going, yep, that was me. Bob still has his uniform.
Yeah, I know.
Speaking of alumni, we got a little present for you. So, Marna, do we have someone special on the phone right now? So, Melvina, so nice to make your acquaintance again. This is Melvina Scott Herbert, class of, is it 1966?
Yes.
Okay. Well, you are live on the podcast right now with myself and Peggy Granderson, class of 64. Did you guys know each other?
Yes.
You did?
Oh,
Yes.
You guys were
we
buddies
did.
then.
Hi,
Hey, Melvina.
hi, Peggy. How you doing?
Good, girl. How are you?
Okay.
Melvina, this is so sweet of you to be able to do this. Peggy and I have just spent a good long while talking about her experience at St. Francis, and the whole goal, obviously, is to honor the legacy of the school and the stories that occurred there. And we just wanted a second perspective from another student there. So I know you and I have had some conversations in the past, and I appreciate you taking a few minutes to chat with us. May I ask you a couple questions, please?
By all means, go ahead.
I'm going to keep the first one open-ended. Just tell us about yourself and how you ended up at St. Francis.
Okay. I am Melvina Scott Herbert, and I came from the class of 1966 at St. Francis. And I ended up at St. Francis because I did not want to go to Norfolk Catholic High School here in Norfolk, Virginia. Um, the African American students had to take an entrance exam, and we were waiting for the letters to come home that summer. And my parents were at work when the letter came. And I was accepted, and there was a deadline date in which my parents would have to notify the school that I would be there. I didn't want to go to Norfolk Catholic because there were two girls in my neighborhood who attended there, and they talked about not feeling inclusive in the things that were going on. They didn't belong to any extracurricular activities. All they did was went to class and came home. Um, so when I got the letter and I read that I had been accepted, at first I was excited, but then I didn't really want to go. So I tore the letter up and threw it in the trash. No, I burned it. I took it outside and burned it. And to this day, and both of my parents are deceased, but to this day, they have never known that I was accepted. My father called the school because he hadn't heard anything, and they told him that they had sent a letter, but he hadn't responded in due time, so therefore they would put me on the waiting list for the following year. And my dad said to my mom, well, what are we going to do? And of course, I wanted to go to the high school in the neighborhood, which was Crestwood High School, public school.
Mm-hmm.
And my dad looked at me like I was crazy. And he said, no, I don't think so. And when my dad spoke, you didn't make any comments, okay?
Gotcha.
So my mom worked with two ladies at the hospital, and they rode to work together periodically. And their two daughters, Carolyn Owens and Joyce Pope Peggy, they were in her
My
class.
classmates.
Okay.
Mm-hmm. They attended St. Francis. So my mother had heard about the school, from their mothers talking. So once she found out that I wasn't going to be able to go to Norfolk Catholic, she started inquiring about St. Francis. Well, she made a phone call, and I don't know what else happened, but I knew I was on the road to St. Francis. So that's how I got there.
So reluctantly you went to St. Francis, then, if I'm hearing you correct, at first, correct?
At first,
At first. And
because
then, go ahead.
Because I wanted to go to the public high school in the neighborhood.
And then how quickly did that change your attitude towards the school once you started getting assimilated and were a freshman?
Well, it was fun. I was an only child. So being at St. Francis, I had all these sisters. In Peggy's class, the class of 64, was our big sister class. And they took that seriously. They helped out with orientation, going to the locker room, showing us how to make sure we knew how to open the locker, and told us what things we needed to keep in there. And then meeting other girls that came in my class, you develop a bond, and you feel like they're almost sisters. And then because we lived together, I really got to know a lot of people. And as I said, I was an only child, so this was something really exciting for me. And when I saw St. Francis when we drove up there, I wasn't as reluctant as I had been because the place was beautiful, and I couldn't imagine what it costs to attend. But I was glad I was there because I felt like I'm on the upper track now.
and do those Peggy and I were talking about her experience and how some of her closest friendships today are still from some of the young ladies there. Is your experience similar? Are you still very close with many of the alumni?
Yes, there are 7 of us from my class that keep in touch quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
Either phone calls or even we had a Zoom meeting about a couple of months ago. And we do keep in touch either by phone or the Zoom meeting we had. And periodically, you may be in an area where one of them lives, and you make a call. And, it feels really good when you go out of town and you can call somebody that you know.
Yep.
And you really don't feel like you're visiting. You feel like you're at home.
So here's a question for both of you, actually, and I'll start with you, Peggy. The first day you went, I can envision 14 years old, however old you were. Did you have the butterflies? Were you nervous?
Initially.
Only for what, a couple hours, a couple days?
For a day.
Homesick?
I never got homesick.
Wow.
I guess because I was used to going away for Girl Scout camp in the summer and
Okay.
visiting relatives out of town, that kind of thing.
Okay.
But as Melvina said, I'm an only child as well. These became the sisters I never had.
And Melvina, same for you? Did you have a case of the butterflies, or were you good from day one?
I was good from day one. After I saw all of the other girls and everything, I didn't care. I was happy then because they were going to be around all the time.
So
when we were at home, your parents, you couldn't have company unless your parents were home. And so therefore my parents worked, and by the time they got home it was late in the evening and usually dark. So therefore I didn't really get to see my friends until the weekend. So now I had 24-hour friendship.
Yeah. And now, were you in public middle school, Melvina?
No, I've always been in Catholic school.
You always were in Catholic school. Okay. But
yes.
So the environment of St. Francis with the strictness and the nuns and all that stuff, that really wasn't a major adjustment for you then, correct?
No,
Okay.
because I had attended St. Joseph's School here, and we went up to the 7th grade. And the city of Norfolk bought the school and the church property from the Diocese of Richmond. And if you've ever been to Norfolk and you know where the Scope is downtown,
of course.
well, that's where our school was.
Okay.
And where MacArthur Mall is now, that's where the church was.
Interesting. And even more interesting, you're one of just a handful of young ladies from Virginia area, albeit not Richmond, but right? When you got there, did you realize that so many of the other young ladies came from other parts of the nation and the world, for that matter?
That was amazing to me because I didn't know how, I was wondering how did they find out about St. Francis?
I know.
Because I knew because there were 2 girls in the neighborhood that went, but I really didn't know anything about it other than that it was an all-girls school.
Peggy said you had a student from Japan, was it?
In my freshman year.
In your freshman year. And I know that there were some international students at St. Emma as well. Melvina, one of the funniest stories I ever heard from a young lady, and her name is escaping me, but she reached out to me from the Chicago area. She told me that one time she came out of that chapel and the nun was standing there and she saw a snake. And she saw a snake on the ground and said she took off as fast as she could to get away from that snake. And that was the reason that the nun noticed her athleticism and her speed, put her on the track team. So I love little stories like that. Are there any that you can recollect, not necessarily of running away from snakes, but do you have any fond memories that you can recall from your years at St. Francis that you would want to, comment on?
Well, this was not a fond memory, but Sister Anna Murray was in charge of travel. And my first year, when we went home for Christmas vacation, it was 3 of us going to the Norfolk area. She put us on a freight train with cattle and sent us home because she said she was saving our parents money. Now, imagine what a train looks like with cattle on it.
Whoa, wait a second. I want to make sure I'm hearing you correctly here.
Okay.
So you weren't sitting down on a passenger train. You were on a train with cows. Cattle.
Yes.
And how close
Yes.
were you to the cows?
Not too far. They had made a little seating area for us.
Oh my goodness.
But when we got home, we smelled like cows.
What was she thinking? That just seems odd to me.
She said, I will repeat, she said she was saving our parents money.
Well, if I was a parent, I would have been probably pretty upset at something like that. But
Well, my father was, but that never happened again.
I bet it didn't. How about you, Peggy? I know you've already talked about most of them. Is there anything else at this point that you recall, unlike going home in a cattle train?
No, that would not have taken place.
No. Well, you're local too, so
Yeah.
Okay. Melvina, what was your opinion of Sister Euphrasia?
Sister Euphrasia was sweet, and she was kind, and she always wanted us to be, well, don't get me wrong by saying this, but she wanted us to preserve our virginity as long as we could.
This is an adult podcast. I get it.
I
Catholic schools.
I came out with it, Melvina. I came out with it the way she used to say it.
Okay, all right. And she taught chemistry, but she taught us more about the people who were saints because they were virgins. And she used to always tell me I had the eyes of a nun.
Mm.
Wow.
And I told her she was looking the wrong way because that was not my intention.
Did you say that to her, really?
Yes, I did.
Isn't that something? So
they used to teach us to be honest, right, Peggy?
That's right.
Well, Peggy had mentioned something to that nature of what had happened during class. So I just figured this message was delivered to you all every now and then, but from what I'm hearing from you,
all the time.
They basically reiterated that constantly, huh?
Sister Euphrasia did.
Sister Euphrasia did. So were they really scared about when the cadets would come over for the dances, or were they open to that? Now, I know they monitored you guys pretty closely. As a matter of fact, will you comment on your experience with these socials with the cadets?
Yeah, the socials were fun, and you danced, and like you said, there were people from other cities, and had new dances, and the guys were always the ones who brought over the new records. So we were always interested in that. There was no slow dancing, so you didn't have to worry about anything happening. And there was never a time that you were alone with a cadet anywhere. So, her preaching about the virginity part, you couldn't go anywhere. There was no way that anything would happen.
Isn't that something? But irrespective of that, you had a nice time. Would you look forward to those dances on the weekends?
Oh, yes. We always did, because it was socialization with the guys. And, like I said, we learned some of the new dances and the new steps. And you got to dance with, people that sometimes you just met that evening, because there was always more guys than there were girls. So you had a good time dancing around.
I see. Yeah, the attendance at St. Emma was about threefold that at St. Francis. What about your instructors, guys? Ladies, I've never mention anything about any of the other instructors. Were they all nuns, or were there some nuns that were non? Were there any instructors that you remember
We had
vividly?
lay teachers, some lay teachers.
There were.
Biology, my senior year, the lay teacher was from Richmond. I knew her family. Her husband taught at St. Emma. He was an alum as well from Raleigh. And her mother and sister lived around the corner from my family. And she and I became pretty close.
Okay.
The phys ed teacher, Mrs. Davis, she taught health and PE, and her husband was a coach at St. Emma. And we had some other lay teachers I really don't remember quite as well as those two.
The quality of the education in retrospect, would you put up there? I mean, did you feel that you got a good education?
Definitely.
Yeah,
definitely.
I hear that. Melvina, you the same?
Yes, certainly.
I will say this, my freshman year, my father was carrying mail around, in this area and around the cathedral, and also the bishop's office and residence. And he got to know the staff in the bishop's office, and he talked about me going to St. Francis, and he went in one day and they said, there is a scholarship that is available for your daughter if you want to apply for it. And the Catholic diocese paid for it because supposedly I was receiving a better education there than I would have in public school here in Richmond.
Mm.
And they recognized that.
Interesting.
Mm-hmm.
In Melvina, I'm sorry, go ahead, Melvina.
Yeah, I was going to say I didn't know it at that time, but when my first year in college, I had 3 years of French at St. Francis. And my major at that time required that I have some college foreign language, so naturally I was in French. And I was the only freshman in that class. And the teacher spoke no English. And I was able to, maneuver in that class with everybody else. And, then I realized, hey, I really got it good.
And I'm assuming because your academic day would consist of class, the bell rings, you go to your next, maybe you have study time, or how did that work?
The nuns came to you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Right. You were in a classroom and they switched around.
Oh, so you stayed in the same room
we
every
stayed
day.
in our homeroom, and they came to our homeroom.
Okay, okay. Melvina, do you attribute the characteristics that you exhibit as a person every day and how you lived your life, at least partially, to your experience at St. Francis?
Most definitely. I always tell people that I learned more in high school at St. Francis than I did even when I went to college, because the nuns taught us how to be a lady.
Yes.
And how to carry yourself, how to speak when spoken to, how to dress, to have confidence in yourself, to realize that the chores that we were assigned were like our jobs in the future. That was a responsibility that you were supposed to carry out, and to the best of your ability. So, yes, I would say that St. Francis definitely prepared me to be the person that I am now.
And I guess that you probably make your bed every day too, don't you?
Oh, yes, and I square those corners.
I bet you do.
Most definitely.
Let me ask you all. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, I was going to say, you never leave your room untidy.
Or
you remember
else.
that, Peggy?
That's right. That's right.
Ladies, let me ask you a serious question here as we're kind of winding down, and I'm going to start with Peggy, and then I'll ask Melvina. The school has very little recognition. And despite significant historical relevance as it pertains to Mother Catherine, obviously we're doing some things to try to change that. Does that bother you? And if so, to what level?
Of course, it bothers me. It has always bothered me. When I go back to Mother Rose Philippine, or Sister Mary Ellen Quilty, if you will, and I did not know it until I left St. Francis, that she would go into the town of Powhatan alone and pull down the whites only drinking signs in the town square and on bathroom doors, colored only or whites only. She did this as a regiment of one. And I'm told in later years, the Klan would come onto the campus. It never happened during my time there. But it's almost par for the course when you look at African American history, what has been left out and what's just becoming a part of everyone's knowledge. Tulsa, Oklahoma, the Black Wall Street, right here in Richmond, Jackson Ward. It used to have its heyday, and a lot of people don't know about that. In this day and time, a lot of people don't know about Rock Castle, even those right here in Richmond. When I was growing up, it was something that was well known in households. There are just so many things that have been kept out of American history. And I'm just hoping that this time around, John, you have done a wonderful job.
Thank you.
You and Fred, and bringing our presence known to the general public. We have tried for so many years to no avail. And as I said, yes, it has bothered me. It has always bothered me.
There has to be, what turned into a place that I found fascinating architecturally when I first found it has turned into something so much more profound. Getting to know you and the cadets from St. Emma, and understanding the significance of that school, like I said, not just on the African American history continuum, but just in history. The exclusivity and the stories and the historical relevance of both schools, and it's just unknown. So this has turned into a crusade for me and for you all.
Thank you.
And man, I couldn't do this without you guys, man. I can't tell you, like Bob and Eugene, how often do we talk every week? It's kind of awkward for Eugene because sometimes I'll call him, like most guys will just call other guys to when they want something. I'll call Eugene. I'll be like, hey, buddy, what's up? Nothing, just calling to talk. What? And next thing you know, we're carrying on for like 45 minutes.
Right.
But his passion is palpable. Your passion is palpable. Bob's passion is palpable. All of the alumni are. And whether it's inclusion in a Smithsonian museum or if it's inclusion in the African American Museum here in Richmond, which we're also working on, or at the very least, if it's some sort of a commemorative marker, the schools deserve to be commemorated. And I'll tell you that this podcast is a neat way to spread the gospel, right? It's a neat way for people to get a feel for the place and what it did from firsthand stories like you. Melvina, would you like to chime in as answering the same question?
Well, like all information, important things about African Americans have always been overlooked, suppressed, and not even acknowledged when confronted about it. It hurts. It really does. to realize that these two great schools now only exist in our minds. And I agree with you. Something does need to be done, and I do appreciate the work that you and Peggy and Kevin and Eric and all the others, John, that you have put forth with these podcasts, because something does need to be done. And I do want to say this. Mother Katharine Drexel, or Saint Katharine Drexel, not only, I didn't find this out until after I moved back home 20-some years ago, in doing some research on my Catholic school and church, St. Joseph's, that I found out that Mother Katharine Drexel helped finance the building of St. Joseph's School. And that was the elementary school I went to that the city tore down. And of course, you know, she financed and had the building of Xavier University. And I did have the privilege of going to 3 of her places, St. Joseph's, St. Francis, and Xavier. So, you know, this woman was remarkable in her work to bring racial harmony. And it's just such a shame, because even in the Catholic books that I have read, there is very little about her, unless you read, you know, one of the biographies of her. But in just the diocesan information, you know, it mentions her, but it doesn't give you a lot of information about her. And that has to do with the fact that her monies went in donations for Indians and African Americans.
Isn't that something?
And, you know, it's a shame, but you know that's the truth.
Can you imagine being bequeathed a fortune, which I think in today's dollar, inflation adjusted, is something like $400 million. I mean, it was an immense amount of money. And I believe she had an epiphany when she was traveling the world with her wealthy father, with Pope Leo, who suggested that this is her trajectory in life. And she obviously followed suit. You know, apparently she also was instrumental in creating or designing the stained glass in the chapel in the building, which was, we found, created by a local artisan in Richmond by the name of Bunce, Bunce. Apparently the brick from the building came from clay pits on the property.
Right.
And I've also heard that she was not devoid of controversy and conflict early on, where there were some local individuals that were in opposition to having an African-American school built. And she overcame, right? And the schools overcame. And had it not been for desegregation and dwindling enrollment, the schools could still, you know, be going on today.
Definitely.
I will say this to any alumni, St. Francis or St. alum, just to be clear, the obviously the property has transferred hands, and despite the fact that it's privatized now and often used for hunting by the owner, he does welcome those of you that are interested in joining, at least with adequate notice. We've been very fortunate to have him embrace the fact that alumni can come and enjoy the property. So we just want to do it safely when no one's out there hunting. So this whole thing has been great. I appreciate everything. Any parting comments from either of you before we come to a conclusion? Melvina, I'll start with you. Is there anything you want to say to your fellow young ladies, or any other comments about St. Francis?
Well, of course, I love all of them. And even though I may not have seen them or speak to them, so forth, they know that the bonds we had at St. Francis and St. Emma still exist, and that our legacy is part of something that is very important, and that we need to make sure that we can keep it going even after our generation has gone. That's why we need to make sure we pass it on to our kids and to people that we know, because it is a beautiful history.
Mm-hmm.
And if, I took a friend of mine up to St. Francis and St. Emmer the year that the nuns announced that they were going to sell the property. And she said, "Oh my gosh." She said, "I really would have thought that they would have kept the school going, And I said, well, because of desegregation and funding, they ended up closing the school per se. But however, it would have been beautiful to be able to have it still existing. And to all of my alumni, I love you. Take care. And let's continue this fight with John and everybody that wants to see. There was an article about Senator Kane having talked about St. Francis and St. Emma at some point. John, had you mentioned anything to him?
I have not, and as a matter of fact, that kind of predate. I've seen videos of that online. There's also an interview with Bob at that same get-together. I think he actually came to the Big House.
Mm-hmm.
And
yes.
Carolyn Lambert was interviewed and a few others, but I have not. Our main focus right now is submissions to the Smithsonian for the African American Museum of the Smithsonian, and also the local museum in Richmond for African American history. But we also have done a couple pieces with Greg McQuaid on Channel 6, and we do conduct historical tours where we actually bring the alumni back to tell their stories, and those have been really well received. We hope to kick those back up. It's just been too awfully hot this summer to do them, so we're going to wait till it cools down a little bit. And I do believe you had a friend of yours that I spoke with that possibly was interested in pursuing a documentary on St. Francis.
Uh-huh.
If that's something, obviously we don't want to talk about too much of that on the podcast here, but I'd love to speak to you offline about that.
Okay, will do. I'll get in touch with you by Friday.
Okay, and we can have that conversation. And I want to close with Peggy. If there's any other things that you want to mention, do you want to shout out to any of your former young ladies? Or
I would just like to say, let's continue our bond. Let's continue striving to keep our story alive. I can't thank John enough. I fell in love with him the day I met him.
Oh, thank you.
He's that kind of person, and my girls fell in love with him. He's an awesome individual, and he has worked so diligently trying to keep our story in the forefront.
What a delight. What an absolute delight to have both of you here and in the studio to be able to reminisce. Now, these are going to be permanently archived forever, so when we're long gone from this earth, our great-great-great-grandchildren are going to be hearing about Melvina on a cattle train and Peggy and and that's the whole purpose, right, is to preserve these precious stories, and you guys just really did a nice job in doing that. And I can tell you this in closing. You just made your alumni, your fellow young ladies proud.
Thank you.
Both of you did. God bless both of you.
And God bless you
and
as well.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for having us on.
Absolutely. And with that, thank you for observing, guys. Jennifer, Eugene, Bob, everyone else, and the folks here in the studio. Signing off until next time. What a special episode. Thank you guys very much. God bless. Good day.
All right.
Thank you for listening to The Time Capsule, Stories from an Abandoned and Forgotten America with John Plaschel. Future episodes can be found on John's website, www.johnplaschelphoto.com.